we have the the server-side application handling all the requests for users. Yes, we were able to retrieve a user by ID, find user by ID, find all the users, or by username and password. Also, we can register a user, we can create a user, or we can update an existing user. Okay, let's clean this up a little bit. Notice that we're not only dealing with users, right? User types of objects. We might need to create websites, pages, widgets, all sorts of things, and it would be very cumbersome to handle all the HTTP requests in one single file. So let's break this out into a separate file, right? So this becomes a little easier to manage, right? Especially when we start dealing with many other data types. So what we're going to do is that we're going to create a separate file and a separate JavaScript file, and we're going to call it we're going to move all the user web services endpoints. We're going to move them to this new file. So it's going to call it user because it's dealing with all the user-related web services. So this is a service, right? So meaning it handles HTTP stuff, right? And this is running on the server side, right? So this is kind of like the counterpart of our client version, right? Our client version is generating all the requests, right? And we are servicing all those requests. We are responding to all those requests. So this is the server side of our client side service. Yes? Okay? So we're going to move here. Most of the code here, let's see, let's move, most everything goes in here. So let me just grab all this. Let's take it from here and let's move it over to this one file. Okay? Here we're going to need, actually we're going to need this too. So our app.js actually became empty completely, right? The only thing that the app.js is going to do, it's going to load our service, our user service. It's also going to load all the other services, right? Right now we only have one service, the user service. So let's require that one user service. So right now we just have our user service right there. There it is, right? So it's a very trivial app.js right now. If we restart the server, hopefully this will behave exactly the same way. So register po. Okay, so it works the same, right? We can change updates. Refresh. Okay, so it works just the same way, right? But what this is going to allow us to do is load many other services, right? The website service, the pages services, the widget service, all these will be added. And also what this allow us to do is break out the data model, right? For instance, right now we're using a static array, right, as an initial placeholder for all our data. Next week we're going to move this over to a data model, a dedicated data model, yes? In a separate file that handles the access and modification of data. Right? And that will be loaded also from our app.js. So our app.js is very trivial right now. Okay. Another change that we're going to make is that on the client side, the controllers, all these controllers, notice that they're using these promise variables. See that? Okay. They're a little bit cumbersome to read. Notice that promise variable, it's only being used here. See that? Right? So a more common way to write this is that because you're using this object, which is exactly what this function returns, right? This function, returns a promise object, right? And since this promise, I'm not using it anywhere else, right? A more common way to write this is to string these together, like that. Right? It's to chain these functions together. Right? And since I don't need the promise function, I can just dispense of it. I don't need it anymore. Right? So this is a very common way to write this. Okay? It might be a little weird if you're coming from other languages, but it's a very, very common. So you should start getting accustomed to this syntax. Okay? And so anywhere else that you see the use of the then and uses of the promise. For instance, I think we might be doing it as well in the register controller. let's see, where's our register controller? So view, no, not that. So public, assignment, views, user controller, register controller. I think we did it here as well. Again, this promise variable is not being used anywhere else, right? So why even bother giving it a name? Okay, and so we can dispense with the promise call, and then it just becomes this. See that? Which is this, oh, without the semicolon, obviously. Without the semicolon. Careful with that semicolon. This is the same thing as just putting this then right after that function call, right? This returns the promise, and right on the promise, we're calling the then function. All right? Again, very common syntax. Same thing here, right here, where I'm going to remove the promise. Right? So we don't need this anymore. There it is. Everybody okay? Everybody still with me? Right? So here's another issue. Notice that we have these thens. Then. Okay? This is very common when you have many communications back to the service. You go back to the service. You have to kind of wait until it comes back. When it comes back, you have to then go back to the service again. Right? And those two calls depend on each other. Right? Meaning, you can't do one before you do the other. Correct? You first need to know if the user exists by username. Before you know that, you can't go on and decide whether you're going to register this user. Correct? So there's one dependent on the other. Right? So you need to have these execute in a sequence. First one, and then the other. The problem is that the reason we nested them was that this is fundamentally an asynchronous call. Correct? And this too is an asynchronous call. Yes? Right? Meaning that we couldn't have put them one after the other because there's no guarantee of which one completes first because they're asynchronous. Correct? That's why we nested them. Now, what happens if you have several asynchronous calls, one after the other? Well, you get this funny looking nesting of one inside the other, one inside the other, one inside the other. It becomes very hard to read one inside. So you get this very skewed source code, right, of these things just being strung like that. So that's the reason why promises were invented in the first place. Right? Promises were invented to deal with this ugly source code, right, of these nestings, right? If you had four asynchronous calls, you would have four levels of nestings. It would be very hard to read. So what this allows you to do, what promises allows you to do, is to rewrite this, right, as if it looks as if they were synchronous call, one after another sequentially, right, instead of nesting them together like this, right? So you can rewrite this as follows. You can say return, right? And then you can move over this whole then over here, right all the way to here. You can cut it from here, right? And you can paste it down here, right? Now it looks, horizontal as opposed to being skewed. I'm sorry, it's vertical as opposed to being skewed horizontally. You see that, right? This looks as if this happens first, and then this happens, right, in that sequence. It looks as if they were synchronous calls, even though they are asynchronous calls. That makes sense? So if you had 3, 4, 5 of these, they will all be vertically one after another, right, as opposed to nested all inside of each other. That makes sense? Right? This will become a little more apparent when we're going to have to do this again when we talk to the database, because the database is going to be another asynchronous process, right? You're going to have 3 processes talking to one another. You have the browser running on somebody's machine, right, way on the West Coast. Then you have the server running here on the East Coast, and our database is somewhere in Europe, right? So you have 3 processes all talking to one another asynchronously. Right? So you've got promises going all over the place, right, trying to synchronize all this communication. Yes? And promises is the mechanism by which we're going to synchronize all these asynchronous calls. So let's go back. So let's register, and we were able to register. So this hasn't changed. The implementation has not changed. Everybody okay? Right. We only did just a little bit of cleanup here. Right. We haven't really done any fundamental implementation. All right. So let's continue.